what is the reason people should do, or how should people go about doing what you think they should do?
Could you ask that again in just a slightly different way?
Okay, you're obviously driving towards some theory
Yeah.
of the proper way of reasoning through argumentation, or sorting and ranking reasons, or testing reasons perhaps and discarding them. And you've taken us from relatively simple examples to more complex examples. And it seems like you're headed towards some sort of conclusion in which you could, describe the best way to navigate this complexity, if I've understood what you had to say.
Yes.
So I just am tantalized by, what are the lessons, the rules, the conclusions, the syntheses that you reach at that point.
Well, I have if all works well, I'll have a plausible theory of what you ought to conclude, and it's somewhat descriptive. So I can look at a bunch of behavior, and I can look at a legal transcript, and I can describe it in terms of, well, look, this person is trying to undercut this argument. So it should illuminate our reasoning and our dialogue in some way. I would like to say it captures what's really going on beneath all the fluff, but so that's one answer to your question. Another question you might have been asking is, how is this implemented in a brain? I don't know. How it's implemented in a computer, that I do know, but it can be implemented in different ways. I'm sorry, that wasn't a very good answer, but there you go.
Yeah, I was thinking that perhaps the evolution of this kind of reasoning resulted in the evolution of lawyers.
Which came first?
Yeah, exactly. Which came first, argumentative reasoning or lawyers? But this is fascinating. And to get back to this notion of ordinary reasoning, it strikes me that it depends upon both the timing and the social context in which the reasoning occurs. So to bring this out of the realm of modeling into the world that we live in, I think about sort of three kinds of reasoning. The first, I think, is the one we most commonly think of, which is, how do you make a decision or come to a conclusion? And that seems to be more the sort of notion that there should be a correct way to do it. But it also seems to me that we use reasoning in two other ways that you both are discussing, and one is justifications. That is, once we reach a conclusion about something, we want to be able to justify how we got there, sort of reasoning back, if you will, from the conclusion. And then the third, and this is something that people who study, people in actual social situations are concerned with, is what I call accounts. And that is, how do we explain to ourselves and to others why we do what we do? And we know that those accounts are very slippery in terms of how much they actually refer to the real reasons for our behaviors, as opposed to the ways in which we justify and explain those behaviors. So I'm just really interested in hearing what both of you might say about those three different kinds of ways that human beings use reasoning.
Could you try to clarify the difference between the second and the third? I was not...
Yeah, well, I think the second is more, so let's say you've reached your Nixon example, you've reached a political conclusion, and what you then want to do is justify why you believe what you believe. Or you want to justify, say in a courtroom, why your reasoning is better than someone else's. I think the reason I think that's different from accounts is that accounts are really, they work in two ways. First, people really do believe them themselves. There are ways that we explain to ourselves why we do what we do, and it's not necessarily because we're trying to convince someone else, it's because we honestly believe it. But in fact, it's because we're quite unaware of the other forces around us that may be actually explaining that behavior. And the second way that accounts work is with reference to social norms and what you think how other people will judge you and your behaviors, or what are the acceptable ways of explaining those behaviors to other people. So, I do what I do because I'm a selfless, loving person, not because I, want to maximize my earnings or whatever. So, I mean, they're related, but I do think they're very different. I think one really does start with a conclusion and then work toward an explanation. And the other really is a conversation we have with ourselves and other people in a social context, if that makes sense.
Hmm?
Who goes first?
I can, as you would.
So I'm going first. So between the first and the second, decision and justification, I'm really looking at justification, and I should have said that to John. I don't know what sort of soup goes on in your brain that leads you to conclude. It's not my job to know that. So what I'm trying to study is, once that happens, and you're trying to explain or justify the conclusions you've reached how would you set up that justificational structure? And that, by the way, is what traditional formal logic has always done. Mathematicians, God knows what happens in them. But when then they try to convince somebody else, they lay out, and that might have nothing to do with how they saw what they saw. So I'm looking at logics for justification. It's not surprising that they have some connection to. Now, account seems to be justification with broader social ideas in there, and I'd have to think about that. It's interesting. I'd like to talk to you sometime to see, where the difference is. So,
I think you're right that it accounts presume a social context.
yeah.
They presume an interaction between the internal self and the social context and how those get mediated.
But so does justification. You're justifying something to someone, so you have to look at their interests, the things they believe, and relate what you're trying to explain to them. You don't just, unless you're a mathematician, but in dealing with someone else. Okay.
I just want to mention there's this whole new research within psychology on how people give themselves a sense of agency, how they convince themselves that they are the ones who are in charge. And there are fascinating experiments which show, for instance, that when you put people in an fMRI scanner and give them a decision task and tell them to inform the researcher about a decision they have made as soon as they have made it, you can predict the decision they are going to make several seconds in advance. So what actually seems to be going on, at least that's the conclusion these people draw, is that other parts of the brain have already made a decision for you. And they are just kind enough to keep you posted about it some seconds after the fact. And then you can concoct a rationalization, a justification. I think that bears upon all three levels, because it goes to show that reasoning is more often than not sugarcoating on top. That's what gives us a sense of understanding something that we're not understanding. What goes on is actually much deeper and much more complex and much more difficult to access. That certainly would bear upon accounts and the way we construct our life stories. I think it's a fascinating area of research, although I think it's really, really difficult to study because they are just so much more macro than these ex post justifications right after we come up with a belief that you talked about before.
I have another question for you guys. Why do we justify things? Why don't we just recite the, if we had the access that Wendelin's talking about to our process of decision, why doesn't the judge in the court simply recite, and then I thought this, and then I thought this, and then this part of my brain fired? What's the additional thing that you get from justification?